Welcome to our program, Luke Harding.
Great to be with you again, Daniel.
I would like to start with a recent briefing of President Zelensky with a journalist. I know that you participated in this briefing. What did President Zelensky tell you about the current state of the war in Ukraine and current state of the relations with the United States, his visit to the US, and long-range capabilities, this authorization to use long-range weapons inside Russia?
Yeah, I saw him on Friday before he flew to the US ahead of his meeting on Thursday with President Joe Biden and his address to the United Nations General Assembly in New York. I mean, it was interesting. It was I think this is a crucial week. President talked about two things. One was the victory plan. He didn't give us any kind of details. We asked him, but he gave a few hints about economic policy, support for Ukraine with arms. He mentioned Kursk Oblast, which is interesting. I mean, he didn't say how that formed part of the plan, but I think you can speculate that it would involve trading territory controlled by Ukraine and Russia for territory in Ukraine occupied by Russia. And of course, he talked about long-range weapons. That was the kind of key conversation. And I asked him whether Americans, whether British governments had allowed the use of US-supplied weapons, British-supplied weapons on targets inside the Russian Federation. And he was very clear. The answer was no and no from Washington and London. And I think a key part of his diplomatic mission this week is to try and persuade Biden to finally drop his opposition and allow Ukraine to strike Russian airfields, Russian ammunition depots using very accurate, sophisticated Western weapons.
How do you see the main obstacle for this decision right now to allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia? Is this main obstacle US President Joe Biden?
I mean, I think it's Joe Biden and some of his team. President Zelensky was quite interesting in saying that it was not all of Biden's team. He said some people actually inside the White House supported Ukrainian deep strikes on Russian targets. And he described this as already an achievement. That was his phrase, already an achievement. So he's trying to push the conversation in that direction. I mean, I think the problem is that Joe Biden is wedded to this strategic idea that if American weapons are used against Russian targets inside Russia, there will be escalation, possibly nuclear escalation. And he has this sort of, he sees himself as the guy who stopped World War III from happening. Now, everybody understands that nuclear threats from Moscow, from Vladimir Putin, is a bluff. And that Ukraine has successfully broken all of Putin's red lines in Kursk Oblast, but also in other areas as well, with long-range strikes, drone strikes, Ukrainian drone strikes inside Russia. But Biden doesn't seem to be able to kind of move beyond this. And I think it's an interesting question as to whether President Zelensky can succeed, whether the policy changes after November and the US presidential election, whether it changes after January with a possible President Harris or, I guess, President Trump, who is no friend of Ukraine. So it's a very dynamic situation. And for now, we don't know which way Biden will go.
Also, the Times reported that there could be a private announcement of this decision. UK and US could do not make like a public announcement, but could privately reach a deal to allow Ukraine to strike deep inside Russia. What is your feeling? Do you have a positive attitude towards this decision to be made this week, privately or in a public?
Well, I mean, that was one of the things I was trying to clarify when I talked to the president and asked him a question. And for now, my understanding is there is no private deal, there is no public deal, there is no deal. What we know for sure is that the British government, we have a new Prime Minister in Keir Starmer, new Defence Secretary John Healey, they are keen for Ukraine to be allowed to use Storm Shadow British missiles on Russian targets. So they are supporting, they're trying to kind of nudge Biden in the right direction. The problem is that Keir Starmer saw Joe Biden recently last week in Washington, and I don't, my readout is the conversation did not go the way the Brits had hoped. Actually, Biden did not agree, and thought that more discussions were needed. And the problem, of course, I've been in Ukraine again. I've been here pretty much since late 2021. Is that decisions are needed now? As Volodymyr Zelensky said, serious decisions are needed because people are dying. Ukrainian cities are being smashed by glide bombs. Civilians are being killed. Kids are being killed. Soldiers are dying on the front line as their positions are wiped out by airstrikes. And so it sort of feels as if, America does not quite understand the urgency from the Ukrainian side. So I think the hope is that may change in the coming days.
Also, I would like to cover your perspective on the Kursk offensive. You wrote books about Russia, about this mafia state. Also, you wrote book Invasion. You have some insight into the Russian government. You have some understanding about the Putin's regime. How do you see the influence of the Kursk offensive on Russia, on the stability of Putin's regime? You wrote a book about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but now it seems like Ukraine invades Russia.
Well, Ukraine did invade Russia, and it's the first time since Second World War that foreign troops have been on Russian soil, Russian territory. And on the one hand, this is clearly very embarrassing for the Kremlin. It's embarrassing for Vladimir Putin personally. He keeps talking about, a plan, the special operation. This was not part of the Russian plan to have Ukrainian troops sitting in Sudzha with the Ukrainian flag. And it's clear that there's been a military consequence, which is that Russia has moved, Zelensky told me, about 42,000 troops from other parts of the front line, which are now quieter. The problem is in the key area where Russia has been advancing around Pokrovsk and in Donetsk Oblast, there's been no reduction in Russian pressure. That they are still pushing forward. But the other aspect, I think, is psychological. Most Russians want to pretend there is no war in Ukraine. They want to turn off their TV and ignore it. It's a problem far away. And I think the Ukrainian strategy is to show ordinary Russians that, unfortunately, that it is their war. Actually, it's their war. Their leadership are waging war, and there are consequences for them personally in terms of drones rattling across the Russian sky, strikes on strategic Russian military depots, and now Russians having to flee their own country because the Ukrainian army has successfully taken territory. The problem is that none of this means that the Putin regime is about to collapse this week or next month. But of course, it does undermine the idea that the Russian victory is inevitable, and the Kremlin has to figure out what is it going to do. And so far, Ukraine has been in Sudzha for more than a month. So far, the Russian military has not been able to push Ukraine out.
Also, Russia has successfully failed to conduct its nuclear tests. Russia's missile Sarmat tried to be launched. Unfortunately, something went wrong, and we have seen some satellite photos which could confirm that Russia has failed its nuclear tests. Although Russian dictator Vladimir Putin still continues its nuclear threats, Russia continues to threaten a total war with NATO. What is your take on that?
I think it's nonsense, actually. I think it's bluff. And also, I think it's increasingly not effective and not really believed. Obviously, Ukrainians don't believe it. But I think London, Washington, Paris, Berlin, Brussels are also pretty skeptical because we've heard this kind of rhetoric, apocalyptic rhetoric from the Kremlin, from Russian state TV propagandists for nearly 3 years. And the reality is the special operation has not gone very well. Russian troops didn't take Kiev. Ukraine continues as a state with some of its territory occupied, but and is playing an increasingly important role in global politics and international affairs. So narrative is is ridiculous. And also, my own personal kind of assessment, having followed Putin, having lived in Moscow, is that he's a sociopath. He's someone who doesn't care how many Ukrainians he kills. He wants to kill Ukrainians. He also doesn't care how many Russians die in his war. But the one thing he cares about is himself and his own personal survival. And basically, he's terrified of escalating to a nuclear level because he knows, or at least he thinks, the Americans will drop a bomb on his head. And this is what is holding him back. So I think we should all take a deep breath, ignore what Putin says, and focus instead on supporting Ukraine and on supporting Ukraine's victory.
And from your perspective, do you expect Vladimir Putin to survive this Kursk operation? And how could it influence the balance of power inside the Kremlin?
Yeah, I mean, I think he will survive. The Kremlin strategy is to pretend it's not happening, to ignore it, downplay it. When Putin talks about the situation on state TV, he uses euphemisms, talks about displaced people, but actually doesn't acknowledge that on his watch, Russia has been invaded. I mean, this is an astonishing fact. I mean, we've got a little bit used to it now, but it feels a bit like a dream. And if you look at the footage of Ukrainian prisoners recently released from Russian prisons, when one of them was told about Kursk, his eyes popped open like this. It seems incredible. So we have to see where all this takes us, whether it leads to some kind of negotiations or not. My sense is that Putin, despite this setback, will keep going. He thinks he can win this war. He thinks he can outlast the West. He thinks he can kind of grind down Ukrainian defenses and defenders using Russia's numbers. It's not about quality, it's about quantity. Russia has quantity of men, of ammunition, of armored vehicles, and so on. So he thinks he can still win, and Ukraine has to persuade him that actually he can't win and that he needs to stop fighting, because otherwise it's going to be a huge, profound, strategic 21st century failure for Russia.
Also, I know that you have been to Pokrovsk. You have prepared a story about that in Guardian. What is this current situation there? How do you see the situation there from a political, military perspective and from the people's perspective there?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a couple of days in Pokrovsk. I spent a day with the National Guard, the 15th Brigade, talking to them. They're fighting Mikhailivka. And what's interesting is the closer you get to the front line, actually, the more optimistic I feel. The guys there from National Guard were very effective, very professional, incredibly focused. And it was strange watching small groups of Russian soldiers walk into the village, which was a no-go. It's a sort of gray zone, being killed, blown up, injured by Ukrainian drones. And the problem is that one group comes in, they're all killed. I saw their bodies on video. Then the next day, another group comes in, and so this is what Ukraine is fighting against. On the civilian side, a lot of people have left Pokrovsk. It's pretty empty. A bit spooky. Places I used to go, eat, relax, sit, everything is boarded up. But there are still civilians there. The market still functions. You can go out between 11 and 3 p.m. I talked to lots of people from Pokrovsk who say they don't want to leave. They can't afford to leave. They haven't got the money to rent apartments somewhere else. And for now, I think this is a problem for the authorities, because I'm not sure what the figure is, but I would say at least 10,000 people are still there. Really, they should go. The war feels close. You hear booms, explosions. Russians they're not going forward as quickly as they were, but they're still going forward. It really is time to leave.
Also, I know that you have been also to other cities of Ukraine. What was the most impressive what was the most impressive your trip around Ukraine for the last 6 months?
Oh gosh, I mean, I've been everywhere. I mean, pretty much I've been up towards Vovchansk, all the hot places. I mean, I just think of one conversation I had in May. I went to Gradivka, which is now under Russian occupation as of the last 2 weeks. It's a village in the Avdiivka direction, between Avdiivka and Pokrovsk. And normally I have something set up, and I go and see the mayor, I go and see commanders. On this occasion, I had nothing set up. I just drove there, and I met a bunch of school kids, 16, 17, 18. And we sat in the grounds of their school. The school was shut. They were learning online. You could hear grads being fired, whoosh, whoosh, whoosh in the background. They were playing cards. They were laughing. They were just being teenagers. They were all leaving. That was the heartbreaking thing. They were all leaving. And yet they made me feel positive. They were going to study at university. They were going to get training. They supported Ukraine. They recognized that their lives, their childhood, their village was finished, but they didn't think that Ukraine was finished. And we were sitting in the sunshine, and it felt like something out of the film. It felt like the end of innocence, the beginning of something else, but not the end.
Great. Thanks for your comments on that. Really interesting. And I would like also to ask you about what would be your next story on Ukraine, if you can give us some insight into it.
Yeah, I mean, my story is not published yet. I've written it, but I went up to Chernihiv region when I came back from Donetsk Oblast, and I've done an environmental story, which I think is really important, about the Sim River and the Desna River, which the Russians basically have poisoned as part of the fighting in Kursk Oblast. They poisoned the river in a place called Tyotkina, and this nitrate, this toxic contamination flowed down the river, killing everything for about 650 kilometers. And I think the story has not really been picked up by international media. This is Europe's first completely dead river. And I was just outside Chernihiv with a village mayor, and we were on the banks of the Desna, beautiful place with willows and trees, looking at hundreds of dead fish, pike, roach, carp floating there. And what I try to explain in my story is that what Russia is doing is total war. It's a war against soldiers, it's a war against civilians, it's a war in the air, it's a war on land, and it's even a war against nature. So that story is coming out soon, and I hope it gets some attention, and that we can actually one day rebuild Ukraine and restore its nature and restore its beauty.
Do you feel that there is enough coverage of the war in Ukraine among Western media outlets, British and American one?
I mean, I do. I mean, I know people sometimes think that the world has turned away and is looking at Gaza, Israel, Lebanon. I mean that's true, but actually, we run lots of stories. I write lots of stories. People read the stories on the Guardian website. We have a correspondent here all the time, and I am, tired of the idea of Ukraine fatigue. I mean, I just don't think it's real. I think people understand that this is a huge conflict. Of course, the world is not following with the same intensity as it did in February and March of 2022. But I think people understand that this is a huge war, the biggest war in Europe for 80 years, that it's not just Ukraine's war, it's our war. It's a war which will determine which direction that this century goes, whether it's a century of autocrats, of despots, of dictators, or whether actually the idea of democracy, of decency, of self-determination prevails. And just in my country, in the UK, we've all been watching a documentary. I'm in it as an expert. There's a 3-hour documentary about Volodymyr Zelensky, including interviews with him, including interviews with me. It's been very, very watched. So Ukraine is not forgotten. Do not despair. People are still interested and they still care.
Thank you, Mr. Garding, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes.